I would love to be there with you. I'm only a couple hours away here in Charlotte, but yesterday I got a low-grade fever, and I thought, I don't want to give whatever I have to somebody else, so I'm sorry I couldn't come down. But I want to talk about this issue of evil. You know that Psalm 86 says, "You, Lord, are compassionate and gracious. You're a compassionate and gracious God. You're slow to anger. You're abounding in love and faithfulness." Well, if that's really the case, why is it that your parents got divorced? Or why is it that you actually buried one of your children? Or why is it that young children get cancer? Or that you have gotten cancer? Or that you were bullied at school? Or that you were sexually abused? Why wouldn't God stop such things? In fact, you may have had troubles like this in your life, and you prayed that God would spare these evils, these pains, and these sufferings from your life. You prayed, and he said no. So my question is, where was God in those situations? Where is God now? Could it be that the God that we pray to actually does not exist? In fact, Richard Dawkins, a famous atheist, as you know, who wrote the book, The God Delusion, said this about God himself being evil. He said, "The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully." And those are his good qualities. No, I mean, when you look at the Old Testament God, it's kind of hard to disagree with Dawkins. I mean, what's this business about killing the Canaanites? How is that slow to anger, patient, loving, kind? I mean, he does seem to have a point, doesn't he? And by the way, you can see Dawkins is a great writer. He strings together these descriptions of God in a very, I think, in a very elegant way. So what are we to say to this? Well, here's my thesis. What if your best arguments to doubt God show that he actually exists? What if your best arguments to doubt God show that he actually exists? And my thesis is this, that atheists are stealing from God when they try and argue against him. Essentially what they do is they commit intellectual crimes, and crimes is an acronym, C-R-I-M-E-S, and each of these letters correspond to a different aspect of reality that atheists steal from God while claiming he does not exist. And here they are: causality, reason, information, morality, evil, and science. And this is all detailed in a book called Stealing from God. I was going to have it there for you today, but obviously I'm not there. You can get it on Amazon, our website, wherever. And the only one we're going to be able to cover today is evil. I think later today we'll try and cover the science issue, but we've got to talk about this issue of evil. How are atheists stealing from God when they say there's too much evil in the world? I mean, why does God allow the coronavirus, right? I mean, I don't know if I have it or not, but I just wanted to be sure that I didn't, if I do have it, give it to any of you down there. So we're coming to you via the technological advances of Zoom. So here's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and do this in 3 steps. The basic question is, if there is a good God, why is there evil? The first question we'll try and deal with is, does evil disprove God? Because a lot of people will say, yeah, there's too much evil in the world, there can't be a good God. Does it really disprove God? The second is, if it doesn't disprove God, what's the purpose of evil? Does God have any purpose for it? And then finally, what's God's solution to evil? So this is what we're going to try and do here in our time here today. And then if I time this just right, we'll have absolutely no time for questions. Now, we'll have time for questions at the end, I hope, anyway. So in any event, let's start. And before we get into this, let me point out that evil is a problem for not just the head, but also the heart. So if you're going through evil and suffering right now, or you're coming out of a season of pain and suffering right now, what I say to you may not really resonate, because you don't really need a philosopher right now. You need a pastor. But I'm absolutely certain about this. You don't need a philosopher when you're right in the middle of evil. But the first step back to wholeness, in my view anyway, is for at some point for you to recognize that God does exist, and he has a reason for the evil and suffering you've been going through, even if on this side of eternity you never discover what that reason is. So if you want to get back to wholeness, you have to at least understand that God does exist and he has a reason for what you're going through, even if you don't understand that reason. So with that said, let's start at point one. Does evil disprove God? And I want to point out that whenever you think about God's existence or not, I think you ought to take all of the evidence in context. I'm going to list a bunch of evidence on the left side of the screen, which I think shows beyond any reasonable doubt that God exists. And then I'll list evidence on the right that might say he doesn't exist. So I don't have time to defend all these. I'm just going to list them here. They're all in our books. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist and stealing from God. I think the beginning of the universe is evidence that God exists, the fine-tuning of the universe that God exists, the information found in DNA. Every cell in your body has this information, which seems to be the product of intelligence. Life itself seems to be the product of intelligence. Also, the very fact that we have consciousness and free will, we'll talk more about that this afternoon when we get into science, shows that this is better explained by God than any sort of naturalistic process. The very fact that we have the ability to reason, that we have intelligence, demonstrates, in my view anyway, that our minds are made in the image of the great mind, God's mind. It's hard to explain reason and intelligence unless there's an immaterial reality and ultimately a mind exists outside of our own. The very laws of nature, which scientists always use to try and discover cause and effect in the universe, those laws themselves need to be explained. Why do they even exist at all? And why are they so precise and fine-tuned? Also, objective morality, just basic right and wrong. Without God, there is no right or wrong. Everything's just a matter of opinion. It's just your opinion against, say, Hitler's opinion. If you say torturing prisoners or murdering prisoners is wrong, then you actually are appealing to a standard outside yourself. If there's no standard outside yourself, you can't say that anything is really right or wrong. It's just your opinion. It's just your opinion against another human being's opinion, say Hitler. Also, Old Testament prophecy, I think, is evidence that at least God is behind some of the Old Testament. And finally, the resurrection of Jesus. And I saw Charlie went through some of the great evidence, the archaeological evidence that we have for Jesus and other figures in the New Testament. All that needs to be explained. And I think it's best explained by a being called God, a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created all things and sustains all things. Now, what is the best evidence that people say is an argument against God? And that is evil. If there is a good God, why does he allow evil? Why does he allow the coronavirus? Why does he allow death? Why does he allow sickness? Why does he allow suffering? Why does he allow the Dallas Cowboys? I mean, there are just certain things that are inexplicable if God exists. Now, does evil disprove God? And I think the answer is no. Evil actually proves that God does exist. You say, how so? Because objective evil presupposes objective good, and objective good requires God. In other words, as soon as you say there's evil in the world, you're presupposing there's a standard out there that is a standard of good by which you would even know what evil is, because evil only exists if good exists. Evil is a lack in a good thing. It doesn't exist on its own. Evil is like cancer. If you take all the cancer out of a body, you've got a better body. What happens if you take all the body out of the cancer? What do you have? You got nothing, right? Now, evil is like rust in a car. If you take all the rust out of a car, you got a better car. If you take all the car out of the rust, what do you have? Nothing. You just got a rust spot on the pavement. There's nothing there. In other words, evil can only exist in a good thing. And so as soon as you say evil exists, you're presupposing that good thing exists. And what we mean by good in an objective sense is God's nature. C.S. Lewis pointed this out. Early on in his life, he was an atheist. He went through a lot of pain and suffering. He was in World War I. And he said there can't be a good God because there's too much injustice in the world. And then one day he had an epiphany, and he realized his argument didn't work. He ultimately put it in the book Mere Christianity. Here's what he wrote. As an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how would I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, you wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. You wouldn't know something was immoral unless you knew what moral was. You wouldn't know what bad was unless you knew what good was. And this is what Lewis is saying. So he realized his argument didn't work because he was presupposing good by which he would call anything evil. You could also look at it this way. The shadows prove the sunshine. In other words, in order to have shadows, you have to have sunshine. In order to have evil, you have to have good. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil, but you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can't have evil without good. So if you're going to say that evil exists, and all atheists will admit this, at least most will, then you're automatically giving an argument for God. You're stealing from God while you're arguing against him. And by the way, some atheists who are consistent in their materialistic worldview will say there is no evil because they realize it doesn't work logically. In fact, Richard Dawkins himself said this. He basically pointed out that if atheistic materialism is true, if there is no God and we're just molecular machines, we're just moist robots. There's no good, there's no evil, there's no purpose. There just is. Here's what he wrote about this. He said, in a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. There is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Once again, eloquently stated, what's he saying? There's no purpose. There's no right. There's no wrong. There's no good. There's no bad. We just dance to our DNA. We are moist robots, molecular machines. So my question is, when Dawkins says something like this, which is consistent with his atheistic worldview, why does he then come around and say something like this, which we read earlier? He just said there was no justice, right? Take a look at this. He's calling God unjust. Wait a minute. He just said there's no justice, and now he's calling God unjust. Where's he getting this concept of unjust from? You know what he's doing? He's stealing it from God. You see, in order to have injustice, you've got to have justice, but in order to have justice, God must exist. So the bottom line is this. The existence of evil doesn't indicate the absence of God from the world, but the absence of God from our lives. There would be no such thing as evil unless God existed, not because God is doing evil, but because he is the standard of good by which we'd even know what evil was. So if you go back to our two-column chart, I really think we ought to move evil over to this side because evil is actually an argument for God rather than an argument against God. Now, this, of course, does not completely answer the question, why does God allow certain evils? And for that, we got to move on to the next question. What's the purpose of evil? So if our reasoning is good to this point, evil does not disprove God. It actually proves God. Now, the next question is, what's the purpose of evil? Probably, 12 to 15 years ago, I was at the Michigan State University. When there's not a pandemic, we go to college campuses and we present, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist on college campuses. I've probably been to Michigan State 4 or 5 times. I've been to a number of colleges around the country. And I had gone through the I don't have enough faith to be an atheist presentation. It's about an hour and a half. And I knew there was a militant atheist in the audience because he sat through the entire 90-minute presentation looking like this. I mean, he didn't crack a smile once And I had some pretty good jokes in there. Anyway, as soon as the Q&A started, he shot his hand up right away, and I pointed over at him. I said, yes, sir. He said, well, if there is a good God, why doesn't he stop all the evil in the world? I said, sir, that is an excellent question. Maybe because if he did, he might start with you and me, because we do evil every day. Do you ever notice that when we complain about evil, when we say things like, hey, God, why don't you stop such and such an evil? We never think of ourselves. We're always thinking of somebody else. God, why don't you stop him? God, why don't you stop her? We never think of ourselves, but we do evil every day. Well, here's my question. If God were to stop evil at midnight tonight, would you still be alive at 12:01? I wouldn't be. I wouldn't be here. God could stop evil, but what he'd have to do, he'd have to take away our free will. And I said to this man, I said, you know, we could spend semesters talking about this if God, why evil question. We don't have that time. So I want to play you a short video. Now, Joe, in the back there, I don't know if this sound is going to come through. Tell me if it doesn't, but I'm going to try and play a video right now. Hopefully the sound will come through. It's just a 1 minute and 46-second video that I showed that night at Michigan State. It doesn't explain everything, but it gives kind of an overview as to if there is a good God, why does he allow evil? So you got to pay attention. There's a lot going on. Joe, just tell me if this does not come through. If not, I'm just going to let it run. You guys ready? All right, here we go.
Is God good? If he is, why is there suffering and evil? Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies and subatomic particles and rainforests and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle or a one-ended stick. So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing, but if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God, because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom. The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom. But let's remember, we don't suffer alone. God will put an end to suffering and evil. And God became a man to suffer with us. God is good, and he wants real people like you to know him, but the free choice is yours.
Now, if you want to see that video again and many others, if you go to crossexamine.org, you can find it. We have it on our YouTube channel, I believe. There's about 900 short videos on our YouTube channel, crossexamine.org. If you can't find it there, just type "Is God Good" into YouTube and you'll find it. That was put together by a friend of mine, Jim Zangmeister, who has gone to our seminary here in Charlotte, Southern Evangelical Seminary. And so the bottom line to the entire video, I think, is this: that evil exists because we have free will, which is the only way that love could exist. You can't have love without free will. The problem is, as soon as you open up human beings to free will so they can love, you also open up the possibility that they could do evil, and we do. So I showed that video at Michigan State that night. How do you think the atheist looked after I showed that video? Yeah, he looked like this. He said, well, you know, that may explain some of it, but it doesn't explain all of it. Like, you know, why do babies die? It doesn't explain why babies die. They didn't do anything wrong. And I said, sir, you know, in order to answer that question, we have to assume there's a purpose to life. If there's no purpose to life, you can't say whether an action is good or bad. In fact, tomorrow, as you know, there's a couple of football games on. And let me ask you a question. How do you know that your quarterback for the team you're rooting for, that your quarterback throwing a touchdown is better than your quarterback throwing an interception? How do you know that the touchdown's better than the interception? The only way you could know that is if you knew the purpose of the game, right? I mean, if there's no purpose to the game, you can't discover that a touchdown's better than an interception, because you have to have purpose to give the play the context. If there's no purpose, there's no play that's good or bad, right or wrong, practical or impractical, pragmatic or not pragmatic. You can't make any judgments unless you know the purpose. The same is true when it comes to life. How do you know whether a particular action in life is good or bad? For that, you've got to know the purpose. You have to know the purpose of life. So I asked the audience at Michigan State, what's the purpose of life? And I had just gone through the evidence that the scriptures are true. So I said, hey, if the scriptures are true, the scriptures will tell us what the purpose of life is. So what is the purpose of life? This is the interactive portion of the program. What do you guys think it is? I hear glorify God. Where does it say that in the Bible? That's the Westminster Confession. You say, well, maybe the Westminster Confession is true. Yeah, maybe it is. But if you had to take somebody to a scripture and say, hey, here's the purpose of life, where would you go? Love God and your neighbor, the greatest commandment. Okay. Possibly. I think that Jesus's high priestly prayer really uncovers the purpose of life. Here's what he says in John 17. He says, this is eternal life, that they, meaning us, the believers, may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you've sent. In other words, the purpose of life is to know God. And then if you add the Great Commission the purpose of life is to know God and to make him known. That's why we're here, to know God and to make him known. And then, as the Westminster Confession says, and then enjoy him forever. But notice this says, this is eternal life. Notice that eternal life is not a quantity. It's not endless time. Eternal life is a quality, that you may know God, not just intellectually know. Even the demons know that God exists, but they tremble, says James. But to know God personally, to not just believe that he exists, but to trust in him. That's the purpose of life, to know God and to make him known. Now, if that is the purpose of life, here's the problem. The problem is knowing and growing in God often requires pain. In fact, I can kind of see a very small picture of you guys in the audience right now. Let me ask you, this is a survey now. Just raise your hand. How many of you in this audience today, right now, have come to God partially through pain and suffering? Raise your hand. Wow, good portion of us. How many of us have grown and gotten closer to God through pain and suffering? Yeah, that should be all of us. In fact, C.S. Lewis said it very well. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to arouse a deaf world. He also said this, sometimes you only look up when you're on your back. In other words, when life is going too well, too good, you might forget about God. You might get more secure and more self-sufficient. And it's only through pain and suffering that you might be woken up. And if you think about this, suffering develops character. And the scriptures are rife with this kind of thing. We only have time to look at a few scriptures. James says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. All right, let me stop right now. How many of you out there actually counted joy when you're going through trial? Yeah. No, I don't. I'm being honest with you. I just want to get out of it, right? But James is saying, count it all joy, because the testing of your faith produces patience and maturity. Paul says, we also glory in tribulation. Do you glory in tribulation? I don't. This is what Paul says. Knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. You have to go through difficulty to really improve your character. Sometimes you have to go through the wilderness before you get to the promised land. And suffering develops character, because some virtues can only be developed through evil and trial. For example, it's hard to develop courage unless there's danger. It's hard to develop perseverance without obstacles. You can't develop compassion unless someone's suffering. You can't develop patience without tribulation. Now, personally, I'm a very impatient person, and I've been praying for patience for quite a while, and frankly, I'm getting tired of waiting for it. By the way, never pray for patience. If you do, everything will go wrong that day. You know, that's the way you learn patience. Also, hard to develop character without adversity, and you can't develop faith. Really, the meaning of faith is trust, not blind adherence, but trusting in what you have good evidence to believe is true. That's what faith is, trusting in what you have good evidence to believe is true. It's hard to do that when you don't have need. I mean, why did Jesus say, blessed are the poor? Because they know they need God. He says it's difficult for a rich man to get to heaven. Now, thankfully, he didn't say it was impossible, because if that were the case, all of us here in America, we wouldn't be able to get to heaven, because by the world standards, we're all rich. But the point is that he's saying that if you're self-sufficient, if you've got it all worked out here on earth, you've got your own security, you might not think you need God. You don't have any faith. You don't need faith. You don't need to trust. The people that don't have it all know they need to trust God. And I know it sounds trite, but it's true. There's no pain, no gain. Actually, that doesn't go far enough. The real truth is more pain and more gain. And Paul says this in an astounding section of scripture in 2 Corinthians 4. You have to read the whole chapter to see what Paul is getting at. But here's how he ends the chapter. Chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. He's talking about the issues that we face today here on earth. He says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. Now, what does this really mean? I think what Paul is saying here is that when we go through difficulty here on earth, we're actually enhancing our capacity not only to enjoy God now, but to enjoy him in the future, in eternity. That these light and momentary troubles are helping us in the long term, not only now, but in eternity. So he says, keep your eyes on eternity. Now, I'm going to give you a trivial example of this, but it's one we probably can all understand because most of us in some form like football. I grew up in New Jersey, forget about it. And so I grew up a New York Giant fan. And in 2004, the New York Giants drafted, well, actually they traded to get Eli Manning #1 in the draft. And the first few years in New York, he wasn't very good. And when you're the #1 draft pick and you're not very good and your brother's name is Peyton, you're going to hear about it, right? So he did. He took a lot of abuse in New York the first few years. Then in 2007, he had a pretty good year. He got his team to the playoffs. And he went on the road with the Giants, and he beat 3 favored teams on the road, including the hated Dallas Cowboys. In fact, we have a saying in New Jersey. It goes like this: whenever the Cowboys win, it's living proof that Satan is alive and well. All right, anyway. So anyway, he gets to the Super Bowl with his team, but he's going up against the 18-0 New England Patriots, led by Tom Brady. They were favored to win by 12 points, the Patriots were. The only team that picked the Giants were the Giants. In fact, the Patriots already had a book ready to be published. It was called 19-0, The Perfect Team. All they had to do was play the game, win the game as expected, and that book would have come out. Well, then they actually played the game. The Giants had a really good defense. They sacked Brady 5 times, which he didn't like. And it turned out to be a pitcher's duel. It's the fourth quarter. The Patriots are up 14-10. Eli and the Giants have the ball at their 20-yard line. They have to go the distance to get the win. Just as it looks like it's going to be over, Eli's about to be sacked on a third down play. He somehow scrambles out of there, and he throws a Hail Mary pass to David Tyree's helmet. I don't know if you remember this play, but it was one of the most iconic plays in Super Bowl history. Tyree happened to be a Christian. He walked off the field going, "Hey, man, this is supernatural." He never caught another pass in the NFL. That was the last pass he caught. And by the way, just before the game, at the media event the Tuesday before, they went to one of the Giant receivers. His name was Plexico Barris, and they said to him, "Hey, Plexico, what's going to be the final score of the game?" Plexico said, "We're going to win." What did he say? He said 17-14, something like that. And, it was 21-17, he said. And they went to Tom Brady and they said, "Tom, this is what Plexico said the final score is going to be, 21-17. What do you think?" And all Brady said was, "Oh, we're only going to score 17 points? Okay," because they had set records that year. They were the top scoring offense in the league history. Anyway, then they actually played the game. And as I mentioned, the final play of the game for the Giants was Manning throwing a touchdown pass to Plexico Barris. And then the Giants won 17-14. The Patriots didn't even score 17 points. And Tom Brady was deflated. Some of you will get that tomorrow. All right. All right, so now here's my question. Then he did it, Eli and the Giants did it to the same Patriots 4 years later to just show it wasn't a fluke. Anyway, here's my question. After the game, Eli held up the Lombardi trophy and he also won the MVP, right? But so did the third string quarterback in terms of holding up the Lombardi trophy. He held it up too. But here's my question. Did Eli enjoy the reward more so than the third string quarterback who hardly played it down all year? Yeah, why? Because he was actually in the game. He actually went through all the difficulty. He actually went through all the bone-crushing hits. He played through all the injuries. He actually suffered to get there. And so because of his suffering, he enjoyed the reward more so than the third string quarterback who hardly played it down all year. In other words, going through difficulty enhances your capacity to enjoy the reward. That's true here on earth, and it's going to be true here once we get to heaven. In other words, going through difficulty will make you a person that can enjoy the reward of heaven more so than the people who live a life that doesn't have much pain and suffering. So that's, I think, what Paul means by achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. Difficulty enhances our capacity to bring good. And not only that, God actually says that suffering will bring a greater good. This is often quoted out of context, this passage, but not here. The famous verse, Romans 8:28, says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose." Notice he doesn't say all things are good. All things are not good. What he says is that all things work together for good. So I went through this in a shorter format than I just did here. I was going through this at Michigan State. I went through all that and I said, so that's why we can see that evil can bring good. And how do you think the atheist looked after I said all that? This is how he looked. He said, okay, I can see how evil can bring some good, but that doesn't explain it all. Again, babies. They didn't do anything wrong. So what do you say to that? How can you say that that's good, that God's going to bring good from that? And so I said this, look, this life is only the beginning, right? From cradle to grave. If there's no afterlife, then this universe and our lives have a lot of injustice and nothing is ever set right. But what if life didn't end right there? What if life continued on into the future, beyond our earthly death? Is it possible that events occurring in this life could ripple forward to not only affect this life, but eternity? And what I'm about to share with you here is an insight I learned that really helped me with the problem of evil. Because if you don't think evil is a problem, you haven't been thinking long enough. But this insight that I learned about the ripple effect really gives me comfort to understand that while I might not be able to explain why a particular, say, baby dies, I can explain why babies die in general. Why do babies die in general? We live in a fallen world. Evil things are going to happen. And I can't tell you why a particular baby dies, but I know why I can't tell you why. Because I'm inside of time, God is outside of time. He can see the end from the beginning. He can see the ripple effect. He can see how everything ripples forward into the future to affect everything else. Why does a baby die today? Well, maybe it's because a baby dying today will be partially responsible through the ripple effect to bring forth the great evangelist 500 years from now who saves millions of people. Can I see how all those ripples work forward into the future? No. But God can, obviously. In fact, think of all the ripples that had to occur in history for you to be sitting right where you are right now. Everything that had to occur in history for you to be where you are right now. Your parents obviously had to meet. Their parents had to meet. Their parents had to meet. I mean, all this had to occur. All these ripples had to occur for us to even be here today. And this ripple effect can go into the future and turn something that was evil and bring forth good. Now, you can see this in some biblical stories. Do you remember Joseph and his brothers? This is the Joseph in the Old Testament, where Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers because, look, they don't like Joseph. He's got dad's favorite, and they don't like him at all. And they sell him into slavery, and they tell Joseph's father, look, he's dead. And, of course, his father was just distraught. Anyway, Joseph goes to Egypt. He somehow rises to prominence in Egypt after going through a lot of pain and suffering, falsely accused and all that. He puts aside a lot of grain. He's the third ranking official in Egypt. When Joseph's own brothers and family leave Israel to escape a famine, they go to Egypt and Joseph sees them. And what does he say to them? You dirty rats, what you did for me, what you did to me, you're going to pay for now. No, he doesn't say that. What does he say? He says this. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. In other words, the evil that Joseph's brothers perpetrated on Joseph actually rippled forward to help them later. There you can see the ripple effect in one lifetime, within one lifetime. Now, a lot of times we don't see the ripple effect in one lifetime. But here's the bottom line. While respecting free choice, God can bring good from evil. God can bring good from evil. In fact, one of the most profound things ever said about this was said by a French Catholic priest in Notre Dame back about 150 years ago. Do you know the standard, before I tell you what he said, here's the standard problem. God is all loving and God is all powerful. If he is all loving and he is all powerful, why does evil exist? It seems inexplicable until you add another attribute of God to this equation. You realize it's not the kind of problem you thought it was, because here's the attribute you need to add. God is not only all loving and all powerful, he's also all wise. In other words, he knows how it's all going to turn out in eternity. So here's what this Catholic priest said about the problem of evil. He said this: if you would concede me, if God would concede me his power for 24 hours, you would see how many changes I would make in the world. But if he gave me his wisdom too, I would leave things as they are. Do you see the point? That God can bring good from evil because he's all wise. He can see the end from the beginning. We might not be able to see it. God can. Now, back at Michigan State, I explained this. And a hand about 10 feet from the atheist went up. And so I called on the guy. I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "I knew of a woman who was raped, and the rape nearly destroyed her. She actually got pregnant as a result of this rape. But she decided that she was not going to punish the baby for the sin of the father. She decided to bring this baby to term." At this point, his voice began to crack. And he said, "This baby turned out to be a boy. And this boy grew up to be a man. And by this time, he's crying in front of everybody. And he said, that man became a pastor. And he brought a lot of people to Christ, and he discipled a lot of people in Christ. That pastor, that baby boy that became a pastor, is me." And then he looked over at the atheist and he said, "If my mom can bring good from evil, so can God." And I said, "You're dismissed." I mean, what else could I say after that? The guy had a better illustration of this than I did. Now, how do you think the atheist looked after that was over? Here's how he looked. He was gone. He ran out of the room the second I said, "You're dismissed." But I went up to the gentleman, the pastor who gave that story, and he introduced himself as Gary Bingham. He's a pastor in Marion, Indiana. He had driven up to Lansing that night to go to the seminar. And so I said, "Hey, Gary, how's your mom?" And she said, or he said, well, she's much better now than until about 4 years ago, because 4 years ago she became a Christian. And I said, well, obviously what your mom did to bring good from evil brought so much good because of what you've done. And it brought good to people tonight because they heard what she's done. And it's bringing good right now because you're hearing what she's done. It's also in the book, Stealing from God. I put the story in there. Yes, God can bring good from evil, especially if we can bring good from evil. All right, so evil does not disprove God. God has many purposes for evil. One of them is to make us more like him, to grow us, to enable us to grow our ability to enjoy him now and in eternity. Now, the final question is, what's God's solution to evil? And as we get into this, we have to answer this question, or I want to ask you guys a question. Does God promise to protect Christians from evil and suffering? Does he? No, obviously not. In fact, take a look at this. What is the common thread running through all of these biblical characters? What would you say is the common thread? Every one of these biblical characters experienced dramatic pain and suffering, even to the point of death. Yet I hear Christians, so-called Christians out there, putting forth the prosperity gospel saying, look, well, if you're not healthy and wealthy, it's just because you don't have enough faith. That's utter nonsense. Why? Well, let's just look at the apostles, for example. Don't tell me they didn't have enough faith, yet they were beaten, tortured, and killed for claiming to be Christians. Jesus himself, of course, was martyred. So was Paul, so was Peter, so was James, so was Stephen. These are all people that had plenty of faith, and they died. In fact, if you look at the New Testament writings, a majority of the writings in the New Testament, particularly the epistles, have something to do with suffering. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Peter is all about suffering. And Paul is writing many of his works from prison. Philippians, Ephesians, Colossians. He's all writing these from prison. In 2 Corinthians, he talks about how many times he was shipwrecked, beaten, stoned. Don't buy into this nonsense idea that the way to ensure that you have a good, healthy life is you got to have enough faith. And if you don't have enough faith, that's the reason you're suffering. No, suffering happens because we live in a fallen world, and suffering can enhance our ability to enjoy God forever. Remember, this earth is not heaven yet. It will be at one point. So what is God's solution then to evil and suffering? The solution is that God suffered himself. God suffered himself. He went to the cross to take evil upon himself. In fact, his pain can be our gain. Now, what do I mean by can be? Because if you don't want to accept what Christ has done, you don't have to. But then you will experience the pain that you deserve due to your sin. A number of years ago, at the University of Michigan, I was debating an atheist by the name of Eddie Tabash, who was a Beverly Hills attorney. He's debated many Christians. And at one point during the debate, we had the opportunity to ask one another a question. And here's the question he asked me. He said, Frank, my mother is a survivor of the Holocaust. She lived a life full of pain and suffering. Toward the end of her life, somebody offered her the gospel, but she rejected it. Then she died. Is she in hell right now? I said, Eddie, I don't know where your mother is right now. I don't know if she had a deathbed conversion or not. But if your mother did not accept Christ before she died, then God is too loving to force her into heaven against her will. Why? Because the assumption is everybody wants to go to heaven. That is not true. It's not true. Why? Well, who's been in heaven? Jesus is in heaven. Well, there have been people running from Jesus their entire lives. What's he going to do in the afterlife? Go, hey, where are you going? You're with me now. How would that be loving? They don't want Jesus now. They're not going to want him in heaven. I mean, the basic question is this: would a loving God send you to hell? Well, what else is he going to do? In fact, I used an illustration with the University of Michigan audience that night. I'll use it with you here. And this is a question for the ladies out in the audience. So you guys are going to have to be loud so I can hear you. And you can raise your hand as well. Ladies, have you ever had a man pursue you whom you did not want to date? Some of you are going, yeah, and he's sitting next to me right now. He will not leave me alone. Well, ladies, suppose this man keeps pursuing you, he keeps asking you out, and you finally say, you got to be loud here, ladies, so I can hear you. He finally says, look, I want to go out with you. And you finally say to him, look, I like you, but only as a... Ladies, why don't you just stick the knife in and turn it? Every man has heard the dreaded friend objection. Now, gentlemen, if you ever get the dreaded friend rejection, I have some advice for you. Move on. She's not interested. In fact, I have some shocking news for you. She does not even like you as a friend. Ladies, am I right? Come on. Because if she did like you as a friend, she'd be interested, but she's not. So move on. Well, suppose, ladies, this does not deter this guy at all. He keeps pursuing you. He keeps pursuing you. And he finally says, look, I love you so much, I'm going to force you to love me. Ladies, run, screaming from the building. Can he force you to love him? No. If he truly did love you, what would he do? He would leave you alone. Well, that's what God does for us. He sends us cards, letters, and flowers. He sends us creation. He sends us conscience. He sends us design in the universe. He sends us the moral law written on our hearts. He sends us Christ. He sends us a Bible. He sends us Calvary Chapel, Lexington. He may put all sorts of clues that he exists in your life. And if you keep saying, no, I don't want you, God will leave you alone. He will give you up to your own desires. Paul talks about this in Romans 1. If you suppress the truth long enough, God's going to give you up to your own desires. So he can't force you into his presence. And look, if there is a God, and there is an afterlife, and there's only two possibilities. You're either going to be with God in the afterlife because you've accepted the punishment that he took upon himself that was due to you, or you're going to be separated from God in the afterlife. And that's what hell is. It's separation from God. As C.S. Lewis famously said this. He said there's only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. So, God won't force you into his presence against your will. He is taking care of evil. In fact, the two choices that God has to get rid of evil is he can get rid of free will, which means he has to get rid of love too, or he can quarantine evil away from those who have accepted his free gift. And he chooses the second option. He still gives us free will, but he quarantines evil in a place called hell. In the end, there's only going to be two destinations, smoking or non-smoking, and you want to be in the non-smoking section. So the bottom line is, does evil disprove God? No, it shows that God does exist, actually. What's the purpose of evil? God has several purposes, among which getting people to be more like Jesus, enhancing your capacity to enjoy God is one of them. And we don't always know why a particular event takes place, but the ripple effect helps us know why we don't know why. And God's solution to evil is for him to take evil upon himself and then offer us the free gift away from evil if we want. Now, if you want this PowerPoint presentation in a PDF form, text the word why evil to 44222. Why evil to 44222. No quotes and no space, just why evil to 44222. If for some reason that doesn't work, text the word evidence to 44222. And the main book that we've spoken of today is the book Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. All the other material you can get on our website, crossexamine.org. All right. We also have a YouTube channel, and we have an app, the Cross-Examined app, 2 words in the App Store. So if you could check all that out. And we're also now teaching online courses as well, right off of crossexamine.org. Check all that out, and we can finally then answer the question, where was God? God was actually hanging on a cross to take our punishment upon himself, but he didn't just die, he also rose from the dead.